In a world of literal gods and god-level creatures, where the majority of societies are demonstrating grand acts of devotion to those gods, in the form of a sanctity and purity or chaos defilement, whatever. Maybe the Wa is the spirit, of Gorka Morka like the orcs think. But regardless, for all of them, the divine is broken down into their daily lives. But what happens to those who reject the gods? Or fear them, or not even that, just perceive them as enemies. Not like the Kharadron overlords who just don't want to hear about your religion because they don't trust the gods, but people who know without a shadow of a doubt that the gods exist and that they are to be feared and avoided, if not loathed. Sounds a little intense. Like something someone with a tinfoil hat warns you about, right? Like, they're always watching you, man. The gods are always watching. That's why you gotta never go to sleep, dude. And you gotta always be paranoid. It's that kind of energy. But in this case, it didn't so much breed paranoia as it did aggressive survivalism. Although those two sound a lot alike sometimes. It is the story of a prized child that was rejected, eventually seen as a defilement, and escaped the destruction at the hands of their own creators. Today is the story of the Idoneth Deepkin. And so for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar or the faction with this edition, the Idoneth Deepkin are the Sea Elf model line, which is beautiful, absolutely stunning. It brings a bunch of the denizens of the dark oceans together and pulls them into a singular story about survival, betrayal, all of that. So let's start at the beginning. As with most factions, this begins back in the Age of Myth. There are a lot of events going on around this story, but we're going to stay laser focused on the Deepkin and the elves as a whole. See, after the collapse of the world that was, the elven gods found the chaos god Slaanesh stuffed and gluttonous. In fact, so stuffed, so chonky, and so gluttonous that it was unable to defend itself. And so, Teclis, Tyrion, Malarian, they all bound this creature up with chains of light and dark magic, and began the arduous, time-consuming process of pulling souls out of Slaanesh's gullet. Now, the reason that they knew this was at least theoretically possible was because Morathi existed. She was the first Chipotle burp that kind of signaled the fact that elven souls can be taken back from Slaanesh. She came out first, and as Slaanesh had devoured a massive amount of elven souls during the end times, the plan was, well, we'll just try to do whatever Morathi did to get out of there, and we'll just pull them right back out of the mouth of chaos. We're going to extract them, and we're going to reform them. We're going to rebuild the elven nations of old, what we would know as high elves from fantasy battles. Now, at this point, Alariel knew about this, but she was more concerned with her Sylvaneth, her children in this new setting. She didn't want to go back to the old ways, she just wanted to start fresh. But Morathi, Malekith, or Malarian, Teclis and Tyrion, they dove in greedily. So once this grand prison construct in Ulghish was devised to be able to cage Slaanesh and keep their location hidden, the next kind of task, I guess that would probably be centuries worth of work, is figuring out how do we extract the souls, and then once you have them extracted, then the next step is reforming them. Of those initial experiments into the forging of bodies with souls from Slaanesh into mortal forms were the progenitors of the Deepkin. And I imagine this scene to be somewhere between the Garden of Eden and a very sterile research lab. Because on one hand, you have the fact that, these gods will spare nothing to rebuild their race. They are arrogant elves from the old world who think that their race is the best. We don't care how many others are sacrificed. Like, they're going to do every single thing that they can to give this race the best shot. And so paradise was reborn as the gods reshaped their realms, respectively, to create the perfect home. They want to seed this new foundation on the right course. And so it must have been incredible to have that kind of attention, right? If you're a fledgling species and you understand that the gods are real, you have direct attention. I imagine this is a lot like humanity in the Age of Myth with Sigmar. Not omnipresence, but just very aware. And I guess attentive is probably the key word there. And so it must have been incredible to have that. But with that attention, and this is kind of where we pivot into the the research lab side of things away from Garden of Eden, comes scrutiny. Because these same deities that are looking at this new creation to restore their old race, they are deeply looking for any imperfections in the process. Did their time in Slaanesh damage these souls? Are the methods of forging them bodies effective? There's a lot of points of failure where this process could break down. And in this first draft of this new creation, which we'll call the Cathai, or Cathay, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, when the population was still very small, flaws began to appear. Now, I'm going to describe this in my own personal language for you, okay? If a person is a cup, and their soul is the water that fills the cup, something seems to be wrong with these new elves that almost have a hole in the bottom of the cup, and that way the soul pours out the bottom. This is, to greatly oversimplify, the spiritual affliction that also manifests in their bodies. Of perhaps hundreds of babies being born, only a small few of them will be born healthy. The others, essentially babies without souls, remain in sort of a coma/stasis. Also, they are born wrong, meaning they are born not like that their eyes were damaged during birth, but that they just literally don't exist, almost as if like the windows to the soul that they don't have are closed. So there is this aspect to it that it does physically change them as well. And from the perspective of Teclis, right, the father of this particular experimental batch, this was all wrong, right? I mean, whatever the cause of this instability was, we cannot in good conscience try to elevate these people if only 1 in dozens are functioning. That's just inviting a lot more suffering than you need. And so they're kind of watching this species develop a little bit. They tried doing a few things, teaching them magic and culture from the old world, this kind of stuff. But after a certain point, it just became clear this particular batch is not going to work. And so Teclis, the Illuminator, god of Hysh, wielder of magic, and patron saint of deadbeat dads, decides to wipe the slate clean and start all over. There's thousands of souls in Slaanesh. We learned a lot from this batch, experimental batch 0.012, that one will have all the answers we need. These elves, however, the Cathai, with their new use of magic and their own, they are elves, they are hyper intelligent, they're reading the room and being like, we are in trouble. There's clearly something wrong with us. And now Teclis wants to wipe us out, but of course they themselves are living things that don't want to be wiped out. And so they ran. But where do you run from the god of illumination, right? You have to be looking for a place of refuge that not even the gods of this setting themselves could really easily look into. And so this is the point of our tale where it pivots to one, like I said before, of survivalism. And it involves a lot of clever uses of their magic that Teclis himself had taught them. He was trying to reconstruct the elven nations of old, and he himself, being the wizard god, wanted his children to be particularly, magically adept. So they're outstanding wizards and problem solvers and thinkers. And one of the magics that they had kind of partially learned from him, but also engineered themselves, was this one to essentially project environments as an aura effect. This is what we know as the ethersea. This is the defining magical ability of the Deepkin. It's how they function, it's how you see flying fish everywhere, it's how they can live underwater. It is a projection of an environment. Basically, a mage, often a tidecaster, will project the ethersea around a war party, and it essentially blends and melds multiple environments together. So, for example, in this case it's water and air. Fish can breathe and move in the air just as if they were underwater. People who are underwater can breathe as if it were air. It works both ways. It works both ways, not only in terms of breathing and movement for, the Deepkin, but it also affects everyone around them. If you're being attacked by the Deepkin, it's going to feel as you're running towards them like you're running in like a pool. I imagine this kind of magic started off being very crude. Maybe the aura bubbles were quite small, but in these early days, they decided that the place that no one would look, no matter how illuminating you were, was the very depths of the ocean. No one's looking down there. We can pop out and get stuff we need and then retreat right back into it. So, projecting the first ethersea, these initial elves, this first batch, slinks into the water and basically will become the Idoneth Deepkin. Now, life underwater in the mortal realms is far from easy, right? And no one's looking for them, but they also had to build anything that they wanted to have, right? There's nothing down there. There's no caves to start building out of and all kind of stuff. It's a flat ocean floor. And so one of the early advancements was the use of corallium. Basically, think of it as coral reef that you can store souls in and also kind of have it grow. This is almost like Wraithbone from the 40k universe, but basically you have, in this case, coral reef that you can direct and create buildings underwater with, or tunnelways, or defenses. Basically, this is what they build cities from. And over centuries and centuries of additions and growth and expansion, these early, what were known as Cathay, now have become something else. As they're building these things, dangerous sea creatures are swimming past, and many of them are going to be pressed into service as beasts of burden, mounts, or whatever. And others are still feared to this day. Like the Deepkin have their own legends about mythical-sized monsters, sea beasts, that they cannot or will not go near. So it's not like they are the undisputed kings of the sea. They're just one more fish in this food chain. And this is kind of where things remain for centuries. That initial group goes underwater to hide, and then from there they start building outwards. At a certain point, they begin expanding, and then other enclaves are founded, and what was the Cathay eventually evolve into the Deepkin. And so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit through their development, because when they really resurface, pardon the pun, is during the Soul Wars. We kind of met them when they were already established, but working in secrecy. But the Soul Wars are wonderful because it gives us a great insight and a segue into why and how the Deepkin go to war. Right now that they've established themselves as their own nation, what does that nation look like at war? Well, during the Soul Wars, Nagash was getting all mad because he sees Sigmar as a soul thief. Right? All those heroes who died and he turned into Stormcast, those were souls that belonged to Nagash in his mind. And so the theme of that entire narrative arc was Sigmar the Soul Thief, but it's hit upon a few times that Sigmar was not the only soul thief on Nagash's list. Because around the realms, specifically along the coasts, but also sometimes further inland, lives were ending, right? Mortal coils were being cut, but Nagash wasn't getting souls. So he knew something was up, but the scale of it is a little bit vague. And as it turns out, what he and the unfortunate Cities of Sigmar people who wanted beachfront property hadn't learned was that this hidden race of elves had found a temporary solution to their little problem. As we mentioned before, the majority of Idoneth Deepkin are born without souls and eyes. But if the able-bodied ones go out, kill people, capture their souls as they die, and then immediately bring them home, those souls can either be dumped into the corallium to be saved and banked, or put into these unfortunates. This is effectively the birth of the Thrall class, and it is the foundation of the caste system within the Idoneth Deepkin society. The nobility, also known as the Akellians, can see, lead, and possess strong souls of impressive willpower. They oftentimes can wield magics or become supreme military leaders. They're more magical than standard other elves, right? This is what Teclis wanted this race to be initially. And so the ones who are able-bodied fit into warriors or leadership, like on a political level, or wizards of some discipline or variety, while the others operate in this thrall class, this lower sect, where they serve the others. However, I will say, these thralls are absolutely not useless whatsoever, because their numbers are needed to bolster the ranks and enable the army to go out and get more souls to keep this super sick cycle going. And I will point out here that there are actually some really great stories that I'll mention later about the thralls in combat. So I mentioned before the ethersea merges environments. There's stories, for example, of, say, a City of Sigmar guy charging a Namarti Reaver or something. He charges the Reaver, goes to bring his sword down on it. The Reaver is blind, but can feel the disturbances in the ethersea as if like it was a move of current of water brushing up against them. And so with elven super senses and stuff, they functionally fight like blind monks is kind of the idea we get. Like if you're going to pick another fantasy trope to put in here. And so they are exceptionally deadly, highly capable, but they're looked down upon internally. It is also what makes the ethersea so oppressively dangerous. Because not only is it hindering your enemies, but it's also enabling you with otherwise weakened senses. The Idoneth Deepkin found out that we can't fix the hole in the proverbial cup that is ourselves, our people, but we can keep pouring water in. And that's essentially what this is. Harvesting souls and bringing them home to put them into your next generation to keep it going. Just keep pouring more water. And in battle, what this means as the Deepkin army is surging towards you, it becomes absolutely terrifying. Right? The first thing you'll notice is a change in the air with this weird tang of seawater and humidity. And that is the first levels of the ethersea projecting around your town. Then all of a sudden, colossal monsters will start coming at you from every direction, like schools of piranhas. But it's actually a very well-organized assault led by a lord on steed. Then you get rushed by a bunch of eyeless elves that looks like you're fighting a whole army of daredevils, who are hunting you down with like echolocation. And then the rest of the army comes in, they kill a bunch, with souls being ripped away from the sky as they attempt to go to Shyish. Nope, not going to Shyish, in the bag kind of a thing. And then they slink away. And one of the things that the Deepkin really focused on, I feel, more when they were first launched, but less in this current battle tome, is this idea of they used to be able to like wipe everyone's memories around them to make them forget. So it's not that they weren't here throughout the history, it's that people weren't reporting them. I feel like that was kind of touched on a lot less in the more recent books because they want them to be a reoccurring thing. And also, I mean, they've shown up in enough campaign material that people are well aware that the Deepkin exists now, so it doesn't need to be a focus. But I wanted to throw that out there, that a lot of the ways that they maintained their secrecy is just by wiping the minds of anyone who happens to survive. Now, to aid them in this are the various types of creatures that they ride into battle. Things that are going to look and sound very familiar. You got eels, giant turtles, sharks, all that stuff. All of it is to serve a utilitarian purpose. And I want to note here that it's not so much subjugation, like they're breaking the mountains and kind of controlling the oceans, so much as it is mutualism. These creatures get food they wouldn't normally, and the Deepkin get souls. It makes their environment better. You're feeding the local wildlife to make them more verdant and strong. Meanwhile, you're also feeding your own race. Now, this all changed when it started to get really bad on the coasts, and the forces of order were expanding, and eventually the two sides did meet. They introduced themselves as the Deepkin, and this is where they kind of grow their humble roots within Age of Sigmar. They presented themselves as the premier people of the sea, proud elves who mirror the nobility of their species' lost past, but in new and exotic ways. They didn't need the forces of order, but there was a lot to be gained by their aid. And essentially the bargain that was struck is that a raiding party will accompany other armies here and there, and instead of preying on humans on the coast. So essentially Sigmar is like, hey, listen, I can't have you killing all my people, but bring your war party with us. We will deliver you to fights that then you can then, check out and bring home both souls and then return back to us. This faction was instrumental in Morathi's ascension to godhood. They acted as her military guard during the ritual, and have since largely cut ties with her for the most part, but there's still some agreements there. And what we end up with as the Deepkin is a good guy faction with real problems and not a lot of good guy solutions. And yet, they're continually brought into the fold because they have a unique lifestyle that can benefit the other forces of order. The Deepkin have their own magics, technology, modes of transportation, like underwater realm gates that do exist, that expand the options and the tools that the Coalition of Order has. They also, as an added bonus, viscerally hate chaos. It destroys their environments with corruption. It kills what they need to survive, like all the different aquatic life, whether it's what they're preying upon or what they live mutually with. And so joining an army to deflect a chaos incursion is mutually beneficial to them. Now, what's interesting to me is how they begin to contrast with the Lumineth Realm Lords. Because, again, the Deepkin were the first experiment. They were the progenitors. The first draft of what would become the Lumineth Realm Lords as the final copy. Once all of the quirks in the process were worked out, then we have, The prized child. These are the favorites. Same dad, different relationship. Picture that family reunion for a second. So I hear you're into accounting now. Yes, I will count the souls that we bring down to the depths and shove inside of our half-dead babies. Yeah, well, Madison's very advanced. She got into a prestigious college called the Glimmering Tower of Hysh. It's a magical place full of happiness and wonder. Like, the disparity between these two personalities is just so different. Now, as far as the classes or the sub-factions within the Deepkin civilization, I was going to have these go over the various enclaves, but they're covered really well in the book. Instead, I want to talk about the three different kind of crusts that the society is broken into. The first one are the Isharon. These are your wizards, a lot of their war leaders, people who have an intrinsic understanding of the ethersea, their environment, and magic. Then there's the Akelian, which are also on the high level of society. These are your lords, ladies, aristocrats, war leaders, kings, and so on. And below them are the Namarti class. Teclis wanted to revitalize old world elf traditions, and these elves took that and evolved it into their own world, right? And so they have the same court drama and intrigue and all that kind of stuff as high elves, which makes for a ton of really fun reading. Of note in this new book, and I'm going to do a full video going into more detail about it, is the emergence of a character known as Methala, Oracle of the Abyss, who has risen up to the Ironok Enclave with a message of grave warning. Because the threat that the Deepkin face now is an existential crisis, the likes of which they haven't really faced since the Age of Chaos. Because the Hour of Ruin, which is our current narrative arc in AOS, has basically rent the oceans up. It corrupted half of entire seas in Akshi. There are demonic energy swirls. It destroys environments. It kills people that the Deepkin needed to hunt, for the souls. It causes poisoning, starving, and so it's up to this caste, this leadership, to chart a new course to avoid all of that. In the end, the Isharon are weaponizing their environment like never before, and that's why we have these really cool endless spells and like water elementals and stuff like that, who, like I said, are going to get a dedicated video. And right below them are the major populace of the Namarti, blind and highly deadly. And they lend their strength to the kind of the higher classes in order to basically enact their will. You need soldiers to do the things that you want to do. This is them. Now, the last little asterisk, as we're talking about the different sub-factions within the group, are the animals. Some are domesticated, but the ones we see on the table are often not. They want them wild and feral and mean. I want to pull everything that's horrible and terrifies you out of the ocean, and I want to throw it at you a mile from the coast. The scarier, the better, and that is the point. Now, like I said, I'm going to have a dedicated video about the newer elements added to the book, but this is my synopsis of Deepkin in general. There are some wonderful resources out there for you. I want to talk about the different books that you can read if you're somebody who's like, that sounds really cool, I want to learn more. The first one, honestly, just grab your battle tome. The 4th edition battle tomes continue to be so beautifully made. With the nice fold-out pages, they got maps, they have a detailed history of the Cathai, what they were doing in the age of myth and chaos, a whole bunch of cool stuff. So start with your battle tome. But I also have 3 novels here that I'd like to throw out there for your viewing and listening pleasure. The first one is The Court of the Blind King by David Guymer. This one has the Idoneth Deepkin as the heroes of the story. Essentially, you follow the path of an Akelian king, if I'm not mistaken. I believe he's a prince when he starts off. But one of the reoccurring characters throughout this book is a Namarti thrall who really does a wonderful job of representing both the class society, like how one is treated differently than the other, but also how deadly the Namarti still are, even if they don't have eyes. Their elven senses are such that they, like I said, it's an army of daredevils. So I can confidently recommend that one. The second book here to suggest is Soulslayer by Darius Hinks. And this one's different. This is a Gotrek book. And this one actually has the Deepkin as being the enemies. And so I try to get different perspectives whenever I suggest books. This one has them as being the opposition to our hero. Essentially, they see Gotrek and they're like, wow, that is the most brilliant soul I've ever seen. It would be a shame if someone were to steal that and put it inside of a blind baby. And then the rest of the book is Gotrek being like, no thanks, I'll hold on to it, right? But it gives you a great sense of what the Deepkin are like on the attack. And the last one I have here is The Harrowing Deep by Miles Drake. This is a short story, but it essentially follows a prince who's trying to make a name for himself. This one is a fun one just for a really short read to get into the aristocracy and the courtly games, I guess you could say, of the Akelians and Isherin. So let's say that you are enthused about this. You like the story you've heard before, you're interested in the books I recommended. Let's talk about playing as the Idoneth Deepkin. 4th edition has seen some big reimagining of rules, but I do think that the core idea of the Deepkin army remains the same. You, as the player, are leading a raid. You need to use the various ebbs and flows of the ethersea to capitalize on the hunt. You don't stand and fight. This is about lightning assaults and moving with the current. At your disposal, you have an immense amount of speed and aggression from nearly all of your units. But how you use their strengths in relation to the ocean's tides will matter. See, there's a series of rules that are basically telling you what the current is doing on any given round. Synergizing what your army is doing on the table with what round it is to make sure, like, when the waves crash, so do we. That's the basic idea. Regardless of the ethersea rules that do change from edition to edition, this army is generally called a glass cannon. Meaning, if you're new to this kind of gaming, it can give a punch. It's a cannon. It can really hurt something, but it is made of glass, so the second something tries to hurt it, it falls apart. So everything can kind of swing above its weight class, but it doesn't want to get hit. There are exceptions, but those are exceptions because they stick out like sore thumbs. For example, the turtle. The turtle is the dead opposite of what I just described. This is a faction that's going to have several tricks to make their units swing, like I said, above their weight class, and you need to be smart and a little cagey to get the most out of them. Now, what this often means in practice is that you're going to win your games on objectives, not necessarily by wiping out the entire enemy army. Although, if they never screen their units, that is a possibility. But your movement, your board control, and the ability to project threat over a huge amount of the game space, meaning your guys are just literally so fast they can move across the board and charge something, is awesome. So it'll take a while. I think it'll take a few games to get used to their rules for sure. And then when you start incorporating like the ethersea, the tides or whatever, the army rules into things, once you really start to get comfortable with those, I think you'll really start to see your games improve. But it's hard to tell you how much in an objective-based game, being able to get from one side of the table to the other pretty easily is really important. It's a great tool to have in your toolbox. Now, if that sounds like you and you're like, hey, where do I start playing these guys? The logical place to start is the spearhead that they just released. This is the Akelian Tide Guard. And this is a fantastic foundation for starting your raiding party. In this set, you'll get one Akelian King, which can alternatively be built as Volturnus, the High King of the Deep, which is the named character. You get 3 Akelian Ishlan Guard, and 3 Akelian Morsar Guard. Those are the same kit. They come in units of 3, and those are your eel-riding cavalry. One of them is offensively focused, the other one is more defensively focused. And lastly, you get 10 Namarti Reavers, which I believe are the bow ones. And that's a great set of models. For me, the part that's most specific is the Reavers, right? They're good archers. They can run, retreat, and shoot, which is just really good. Like I said, being able to get all over the table is your strength. But let's be honest, the hotness of this box is the King and 6 Eels. In fact, if you know that you just need the Reavers to go and sit on objectives or whatever, you can buy 2 boxes of this and not feel bad. You can have 6 of each type of eel, and then a named character rider and the Akelian King miniature. And that would not really be a waste of money whatsoever. Throw in a turtle to pin stuff down in the center of the board, and a few more heroes, and you got yourself an army. I say that a little flippantly, but what I mean is, as a starter set, this is giving you, 1, access to the things that make your faction incredible. The eels have so much speed. Not only that, most of this stuff is multi-kits, meaning your value can change depending on what models you see in your collection as needed. The fact that you get one hammer and one shield, I think, for the purposes of learning the game or learning the faction in the form of the Ishlan or Morsar Guard is wonderful. Not to mention the other models that you can start to bring in that all work really well with this. Like, there's not really anything in the range that is like, ah, crap, I don't want to work with eels. You know what I mean? They're just such a great unit. And always have been. This isn't a massive model range, and so it's not like anything you're going to pick in terms of strategy contradicts with the stuff in this box. The Idolin of Mithlon will only amplify your magic abilities and the ethersea and all this kinds of cool stuff. Tidecasters will just give your eels more options. Like, it builds on itself. So I do think this is a really strong start box. And of course, I want to end this video, like I end all of them, by simply asking, why is this cool? Why would anyone want to play the Idoneth Deepkin? And to me, these are, in my opinion, the peak Dark Elves, or Dark Eldar, I should say, of Age of Sigmar. And I say Dark Eldar because in 40k, their Dark Elves are much more about like speed and aggression and using light vehicles. This is kind of like that, whereas I would say Daughters of Cain, they are also very Dark Elf themed, of course, but it's different. They have a sacrifice and a religious focus, but this feels very different, both aesthetically, in terms of their writing, what they contribute to the setting. They work together, but they're not like buds. I love the idea of every battle being a raiding party, right? Just go out and see how many souls you can get, because it can actually feel like the scale of war that is sometimes described. And what I mean by that is, you'll read some of these Black Library books and they'll be like, there was thousands and thousands of Stormcast lined up or whatever. And you get this sense where like, well, I can't actually play that on the table unless I'm playing like the most epic apocalypse game ever. However, when the narrative is you're a small raiding party that is just supposed to smash and grab souls, that actually works on scale with what you and I play on the table, and I love it. Another thing I've mentioned a few times, specifically with the Sylvaneth and then a number of other factions, is I like this idea of the direction that the writers for AOS are going, where the realms are alive themselves. We see this a lot, specifically with Lumineth. They have the different elementals for the different disciplines that they study. There's the mountain guys, there's the river dudes, Skyfox, whatever his name is. But this idea that the realms themselves are a character in this grand story. The Deepkin really lean into that. They hid in nature, they developed within it, alongside it, mutualistically, and are now learning to use it as a weapon. Not in a way of like dominating their enemies, but allowing nature to be unleashed in such a way that it does what it wants. Which, as a little bit of a preview, is exactly what those new water elementals are. They give the ocean a level of sentience and form, and then they just let it go wild. And whether it's elementals, golems, channeling rivers, volcanoes, whatever, any way that the realms themselves can be portrayed as an active part of the story, I enjoy. And this book really does lean into it more than the others, simply because they added new stuff, new units to kind of accommodate that. And we'll cover them as we explore all the new stuff that was added in a separate video. But I would love to hear your thoughts. If you're someone who plays Deepkin and has consistently, you got the new Battle Tome in your hands, if you have any advice for new players, where to expand from the Spearhead set, tips and tricks, synergies, whatever, please leave them in the comments below. I always pin the most helpful comments for folks, so new people can just scroll down and see great resources. And I'm super grateful for anyone who does. This isn't a faction that I play. I've actually never played Deepkin myself, but I played against them a lot, and what I described is what it feels like to get your butt kicked from like 30 inches away because all of a sudden turn one, they're just on you. So it might be a little bit biased, but, it is what it is. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what faction you would like to hear next. I'm planning to do the Blades of Khorne like this. This is just a much easier approach to all these new battle tomes than a full lore week, and I'm enjoying them. So let me know in the comments down below, and I will catch you then. Happy wargaming, friends.